Okay, so let's briefly revisit World War One. As many of you know, the Western nations, the U.S., Great Britain, and France, came out of the war very, very disillusioned. It was the classic instance of over promising and under delivering. World War One was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and it did not turn out to be that way. There was a sense in the West that there the people of the West had been manipulated into the war by industrialists and militarists, and they swore it would never happen again. And uh, folks are allergic to war. They just don't want the same thing to happen. Now, there's this famous quote, those that don't know the past are doomed to repeat it. It's a cliche. It may have a germ of truth, but this is an example of that cliche being completely incorrect. What folks were doing in Europe and the US in the 1930s, they were trying not to repeat the mistakes of the past, right? They said we're not going to go after Hitler. We're not going to try to stop Hitler because we're not going to get tricked into a war again. Well, they should have stopped Hitler. They learned the wrong lesson. So that's the thing that I don't like about the quote, those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. You can learn the wrong lesson from history. You know, there's nothing that says you're going to learn the right lesson. And the Western powers learned the wrong lesson from World War One, and they let Hitler go crazy. Okay, so something else has to be emphasized that is kind of a backdrop that's often forgotten about the thinking in the West, especially about entry into World War II. And that is the fear of the Soviet Union. One of the important consequences of World War One is the Russian Revolution. The Tsar is overthrown, and the communist government, the Bolshevik government, same thing, takes over. Ultimately, Stalin, by the late 1920s, will become the communist dictator. Now, very briefly, communism is an authoritarian form of government. The state rules supreme. Stalin was the head of the Communist Party. The Communist Party controlled the state. There's no private sector in classic communism. The state runs the entire economy. And socialism or communism terrified many in the West. Now, in some ways, Hitler and Stalin are the same. You know, they're authoritarian, the state rules supreme. There's an important difference, though. Stalin is not into the whole master race thing, as is Hitler. Communism, in theory anyway, is supposed to be very encompassing of all peoples. So it doesn't really divide folks up into race. It wants to create a global order of workers, regardless of race. Well, of course, Hitler is very, very different. He's totally race obsessed, totally race obsessed. So that's one of the differences between Stalin and Hitler. Another difference is you still had a private sector economy in Germany, although it was mobilized at the behest of the state and for the state. So the state has a lot of say in the economy in German. The German state had a lot of say in the German economy, but it didn't totally take over the German economy as happened in the Soviet Union. Okay, so some of the differences there. Back to the Soviet Union. Many in the West and in Japan feared communism, and they feared Stalin more than they feared Hitler. Now you might think, well, how could that be, you know, given that Hitler's involved in the Holocaust and, you know, Stalin was bad, but Hitler was worse. Well, what you have to remember is the Holocaust doesn't occur. Now, there are murders of Jews and others in the Soviet Union, beginning with the invasion of Russia in June 1940. But when we think of the horrors of the Holocaust, of the death camps, that doesn't those don't really come online until late 41, early 42. So in the 30s, you don't have the massive death camps that you're going to have later on in World War II. Also, many in the West were indifferent to the fate of Jews. They were anti-Semitic or just didn't care. And you could say, well, how could they look the other way? Well, how many Americans looked the other way at what was happening to African Americans in the South with the beatings and the lynchings and just the treatment of African Americans in the South? Um, Horrific. And so sure, Jews were being treated in a horrendous way. They were stripped of their citizenship. They were stripped of their businesses. Many were thrown in early forms of concentration camps, which were much more like jails, although, of course, there were executions. Um, so horrible things. Their temples were being destroyed, synagogues, I should say, were being destroyed. But many in the West were just indifferent to that, and they also thought that the attacks against Hitler in the 1930s were hysterical. They thought that there were folks out there that were trying to gin up another war. So Hitler in the 1930s, when a lot of people were looking at him from Great Britain, France, the U.S., and Japan, they fear Stalin and they fear the communist form of government more than they do Hitler. And that's just an important thing to keep in mind. That for many in the West, not all, including Franklin Roosevelt, but for many in the West, communist Russia was a greater global threat than was Nazi Germany. Okay, that's often forgotten now, but it's the background to many of the decisions that are going to be made in the 1930s. Now, to talk about, for instance, of the fear of communism, let's go to the United States and the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. What the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 did, it severely restricted immigration into the United States from places such as Eastern Europe and Italy. Now, why did this happen? Why did this act happen in the 1920s? The creation of the Soviet Union. A lot of folks in the United States thought that many of the Jews that were coming into the United States from Eastern Europe were potentially communists, the same with Italians that were coming into the United States, that they were anarchists, that they were leftist, and that they needed to be kept out, that they would bring a kind of a communist fervor to the United States. In addition, there were many in the United States who were race obsessed as well, who thought that the Jews from Eastern Europe, the Italians from Southern Europe, were lower on the racial scale than were whites, say, from England and Ireland and Northern Europe. So there's this fear that there's a mongrelization, and I'm putting that word in quotes, of the body politic of the United States. That there were too many of these lesser whites being led into the United States, and what it was doing was it was mongrelizing and weakening the white race in the U.S. So you've got this potent and toxic mixture of anti-communism and racism against immigrants. But long story short, in 1924, restriction into the United States is severely restricted. 150,000 immigrants were allowed into the United States after 1924. Before 1924, you'd have between 500,000 and 1 million coming in every year. But here's the kicker. Okay, so 150,000 immigrants into the United States. 88%, or I'm sorry, 86%. I'm not going to test you on this, so don't get all fussed, but it's fascinating, especially given the discussions that we have over immigration today. 80% of the quotas after 1924 were given to Europeans from Northern and Western European countries, i.e. countries that had traditional white people. In an age of racism where there were gradations of whiteness. So almost 90% of the folks that were allowed into the United States after 1924 were from countries that were considered safely white and high up on the racial scale. And so the other thing, and I mentioned this in passing, but it's worth talking about again. The 1924 Quota Acts forbid Japanese from coming into the United States, which absolutely infuriated the Japanese, as you might imagine. The Japanese had allied with the Allies during World War II. They were not happy with what they had been given after World War II, so they're not happy. It wasn't like a ton of Japanese were coming into the U.S., mostly to the West Coast, Hawaii, but for immigration from Japan is forbidden after 1924, pretty remarkably. So the door basically is slammed in the face of Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and Japanese. This is going to have huge consequences when Hitler comes into power, because suddenly now Jews, many of whom, I mean hundreds of thousands, had been able to get into the U.S. between the 1890s and 1924. Suddenly the door is shut. So the chickens are going to come home to roost on the Johnson-Reed Act and the tragic consequences within a decade. Real quick, fun fact. The president that basically undermined the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 and unleashed the second great wave of immigration into the United States, which is again one of the very polarizing issues of the time, and I'm not going to weigh in on either side, but it was Lyndon Johnson from Johnson City, Texas. Johnson did a lot while he was president, and one of the things that he did, which people often forget, is he really, really loosened the quotas for immigration quotas, not only from Europe but also from Asia during his presidency, which has set up what we're having today is kind of an echo of the fights in the 1920s without the whole communist element, although I think the racial element is still there. So I'll stop the podcast here. Big point, take-home point. The background noise for a lot of folks in the West, and certainly in Germany, but let's look at the West now. Stalin and Communist Russia, a greater threat than Hitler and Germany.